Marcus Williams was a man who had spent most of his life focused on achieving success. A renowned doctor in the city of Avilton, he had earned a reputation for his exceptional skills in medicine and his unwavering commitment to his patients. His wealth and stature were the product of years of hard work. But despite all his professional accomplishments, Marcus often felt a quiet emptiness that success alone couldn't fill. His days were long, consumed by hospital rounds, surgeries, and patient consultations. His pristine high-rise apartment overlooked the city's skyline, a view he had long grown accustomed to, yet it had become a backdrop to his solitary routine. Outside of his career, his life was orderly, predictable, and, at times, lonely. Though surrounded by luxury and admiration, he found himself missing something more profound, a connection, a sense of belonging. This longing led him to a community event one warm autumn evening, where life pulsed through every corner of the neighborhood. The streets were alive with the hum of excited voices and the vibrant colors of food stalls selling everything from spicy barbecue to homemade sweets. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the crowd, and families were gathered together in groups, their laughter rising in the air like music. Children raced between stands, their energy contagious as the sound of live music echoed through the streets, blending with the rhythm of dancing feet in joyful conversation. It was here, amidst the vibrant chaos of families and friends, that Marcus met Amara. Her presence was magnetic, her energy, a stark contrast to the rigidity of his world. She moved through the crowd with ease, greeting familiar faces with warmth, a mother's love in every gesture, and a quiet strength that captivated him. As the evening wore on, the glow of string lights seemed to illuminate the possibility of a new chapter, one that Marcus couldn't yet imagine, but would soon find impossible to ignore. The evening that Marcus met Amara was a turning point, though neither of them knew it at the time. What started as a casual conversation over a glass of lemonade soon turned into something much deeper. Amara's laughter was warm, her words thoughtful, and her smile genuine. She spoke passionately about her work as a community organizer on the south side of Avilton, a neighborhood often overlooked by the rest of the city. Her voice carried a sense of purpose, a drive that had been cultivated through years of advocating for families who struggled to make ends meet. She wasn't just working for a paycheck, she was working to make a difference, to create change where it was needed most. As Marcus listened, something inside him stirred. He had always been taught that success was measured by how much one could accumulate, wealth, accolades, status. But here was Amara, a woman who had none of these things, yet was rich in purpose, in spirit, in her deep connection to the community she served. There was a raw authenticity to her, a contrast to the polished, somewhat detached world Marcus inhabited. The more they spoke, the more he found himself drawn to her, not just because of her beauty, but because of the way she saw the world, and how she so effortlessly made him see it differently. But it wasn't just their connection that set the stage for change. Later that week, Marcus received an invitation to a family gathering at Amara's home. She had spoken about her 5 children in passing: Kai, Zara, Nia, Micah, and little Amari. But the reality of being in a home bustling with the energy of a large, tight-knit family hit him all at once. As he stood at the doorstep, Marcus felt a knot of uncertainty tighten in his stomach. It wasn't just Amara he was about to meet. It was her whole world, the world he wasn't sure he was ready for. The moment he walked in, he was greeted by a whirlwind of energy. Kai, the eldest at 17, was sprawled on the couch, sketching in a notebook, his headphones on, music leaking into the room. Sarah, 10, was busy organizing a pile of books she just finished reading, her glasses perched precariously on the tip of her nose. Nia, 8, was attempting to teach Micah, 5, how to ride a bike in the cramped hallway, while baby Amari, still a toddler, toddled around with a toy in hand, babbling excitedly. Amara, graceful as ever, smiled warmly as she ushered him in, introducing him to each of the children with a proud mother's gaze. It was an overwhelming sight, a contrast to the quiet and orderly life Marcus had known. He watched, fascinated, as Amara moved effortlessly between tasks: mother, organizer, mediator, friend. There was no hesitance in her actions. She was in complete harmony with the chaos of her home. As he sat down to dinner with them, Marcus could see the bond they shared, how deeply they loved and depended on each other, how each child had found their place in the world, despite the challenges they faced. As the evening progressed, Marcus felt a quiet unease settle in. It wasn't just about the children, who were kind and welcoming, but the responsibility that came with being part of this family. Could he really step into their world? Could he love these children, who weren't his own, as they deserved? Could he, a man who had spent so much of his life alone, learn to be part of something bigger than himself? Amara seemed to sense his hesitation, offering a small smile as she watched him interact with her children. "It's a lot to take in," she said softly, her voice steady. "But they're mine, Marcus. They're my heart. If you want to be part of this, you'll need to understand them, all of them." The words struck him. She wasn't asking for him to be perfect. She wasn't asking him to step into their lives and make it easy. She was simply asking him to be real, to show up and try. But in his mind, the doubt still lingered. How could a man like him, who had everything but nothing in terms of family, ever truly understand the challenges they faced? The following days were filled with moments of reflection for Marcus. He found himself at the hospital, thinking more about Amara and her children than the medical cases in front of him. He questioned everything he had believed about family, about connection, and with each passing day, he felt more compelled to explore this new chapter, despite the unease that still clung to him. Amara, too, faced her own challenges. She had always been fiercely independent, carrying the weight of her children's needs and the burdens of their past. She didn't need anyone, or so she thought, but there was something about Marcus that made her question that. When they spoke on the phone or met for coffee, she felt seen in a way she hadn't for years. She saw the man beneath the doctor's mask, vulnerable, questioning, searching for something deeper. But as much as she was drawn to Marcus, she also knew the reality of their different worlds. Could they merge their lives without losing what made them both who they were? Could Marcus love her children, truly love them, without hesitation, without fear? Could he navigate the complexities of their world, a world that was messy and often difficult, without feeling overwhelmed? One evening, just as Marcus was beginning to wrestle with these questions, Amara called him. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight, "I need you to come." Now. His heart raced. He knew something had happened, but he wasn't prepared for the urgency in her tone. When he arrived at her apartment, he found Amara pacing in the living room, her face a mask of worry. "It's Kai," she explained. "He's been struggling with some things. He's been keeping it to himself, but I think it's all becoming too much." Kai, her eldest, was often quiet and withdrawn, especially since his father's passing years ago. He had always been the strong one, the one who kept things together, even when everything around him was falling apart. But Amara had sensed something was changing. Now she could see it in his eyes. Something was broken. Something was shifting. Without thinking, Marcus stepped forward. He wasn't sure how he could help, but he knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing. In that moment, he realized something important. His role in this family wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being there, about showing up and listening. The conversation with Kai wasn't easy. He was reluctant at first, closed off, unwilling to open up. But slowly, through patience and persistence, Marcus found a way in. He spoke to Kai not as a doctor, but as someone who understood the weight of loss, someone who knew what it was like to feel like you're carrying the world on your shoulders. By the end of the night, Kai had begun to talk. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a breakthrough. And in that moment, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. There would be struggles, there would be challenges, but this was a family and he had a place in it. It was the catalyst Marcus needed to realize the depth of his connection to Amara's world. And it was the beginning of his own transformation, a journey of growth, acceptance, and the willingness to embrace a new kind of love. The days following the tense conversation with Kai were difficult for Marcus. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of a cliff, peering into an unfamiliar world. Though the breakthrough with Kai had felt like a moment of real progress, the weight of the challenges ahead seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. His connection to Amara and her children deepened, but so did his doubts about his ability to truly belong to their world. Still, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away. The love he felt for them, for Amara, was too deep, too real. Then one evening, the tension in their lives spiked in a way that Marcus hadn't anticipated. It was late when Amara called him again. "Marcus, something happened," she said, her voice trembling. "I need you to come, please." By the time he arrived at her apartment, the atmosphere was thick with tension. He stepped into the living room to find Amara standing by the window, her expression a mixture of frustration and concern. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, and for a moment he feared the worst. Kai was out with some friends, and there was an altercation, Amara explained quickly, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "The police are here. They're questioning him." Marcus's heart sank. He knew that Kai had been struggling with his emotions, but he hadn't expected something like this to happen. Without a second thought, he made his way to the front door, where two police officers stood, their faces stern. The taller officer, a middle-aged man with short-cropped hair, stepped forward as soon as Marcus arrived. "Are you Marcus Williams?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Yes," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady, though a knot had formed in his stomach. "What happened? Is Kai okay?" The officer glanced at his partner, who stood a few steps behind, arms crossed. "We're just asking him a few questions," the officer said, his tone not quite as cold as before, but still guarded. "There's been an incident. We need to understand exactly what happened before we can proceed." Amara, still standing at the door, stepped in closer. "What kind of incident?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "My son isn't a criminal. He was just—" "Ma'am, we're just doing our job," the second officer interrupted. "Please let us do our work." The words stung, but Amara didn't back down. Marcus felt the tension rising in his chest. He could see how uncomfortable the situation was becoming, how defensive Amara was growing, how the officers seemed to be perceiving her as just another angry mother trying to shield her child. He could sense the misunderstanding in the air, but there was also something more, a deeper divide that wasn't just about this incident. It was about the assumptions, the judgments, the deep-seated biases that lurked beneath the surface. He stepped forward, his heart pounding. "I'm here now," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Can we talk? I'm his stepfather. I can help." He glanced at the officers, searching their eyes for some sign of understanding, some acknowledgement that he wasn't just another outsider trying to force his way in. The officers exchanged a quick glance. The first officer nodded, though his posture remained stiff. "Fine," he said, stepping back slightly. "But let's keep this civil, all right?" Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath. "Of course. I just want to understand what happened." The officer led Marcus to the living room, where Kai sat on the couch, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on the floor. He looked exhausted, worn, like a boy who had been asked to carry the weight of the world and wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it. The room was heavy with the silence of unspoken words, the kind of silence that filled a space with everything that wasn't being said. "Kai," Marcus said gently, approaching him with a softness he hadn't realized he had in him. "You okay?" Kai nodded but didn't speak, his body tense, his eyes flickering with a mix of anger and frustration. Marcus could feel the distance between them growing, but he didn't let it deter him. He sat down next to Kai, leaning in slightly. "It's okay. You don't have to talk about it right now if you don't want to," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm just here. We'll get through this together." The officers were still standing by the door, watching the exchange with quiet intensity. The silence between them all felt thick, charged. Marcus couldn't help but notice how they seemed to watch every move he made. He realized then that they weren't just seeing him as Kai's stepfather. They were seeing him through the lens of their own assumptions, their own biases. The very fact that a man like him, a doctor with a reputation and status, was involved in this situation seemed to make them more on edge. It was as if his presence was an unwelcome disruption to their expectations of how things should play out. "Marcus," Amara's voice broke through the tension. She stepped into the room, her gaze moving from her son to the officers. "Kai didn't do anything wrong. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." The officer's expression hardened. "We'll see about that," he said, turning to Kai. "But you're going to need to answer our questions, son. We're not here to play games." Marcus's chest tightened. He could feel the judgment in the air, heavy and suffocating. The officers weren't just questioning Kai. They were questioning his entire existence, his worth, his right to be seen as something more than the circumstances of where he came from. Marcus knew it wasn't personal, but it felt personal nonetheless. He turned to Amara, his eyes meeting hers. He saw the worry in her gaze, the fear of seeing her son labeled, categorized, dismissed. He understood now. This wasn't just about the incident. This was about the long history of people like Kai, people like Amara, who had been made to feel small, invisible, or guilty simply because of who they were. But instead of stepping back, Marcus found himself moving forward. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not to Kai, not to Amara, not to their family. He turned to the officers, his voice steady but resolute. "I know you have a job to do," he said, "but I'm asking you to do it with understanding. Kai is a good kid. He made a mistake, maybe, but he's not a criminal. He deserves a chance, just like anyone else." The room seemed to pause, held in the tension of his words. For a moment, neither of the officers responded. Marcus could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. But then, something shifted. The taller officer exhaled, his body relaxing just a fraction. "We're not here to make assumptions about anyone, sir," the officer said, his voice less sharp now, more neutral. "We just need to figure out what happened. That's all." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze softening as he turned to Kai. "You don't have to go through this alone," he said quietly, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "We're in this together. Let's get through it, step by step." The officer watched the exchange between Marcus and Kai, his expression unreadable, but there was a shift in the air. The tension began to loosen, ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Marcus to feel like a bridge had begun to form. Not just between him and the officers, but between him and the world that had always seemed so distant. As the conversation continued, the dialogue began to flow more freely. Questions were asked, explanations were given, and slowly, a sense of understanding began to emerge. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but in that moment, Marcus realized something important. Sometimes the greatest challenges we face aren't external. They're the internal walls we build around ourselves, the prejudices and assumptions we cling to, the fear that keeps us from truly seeing each other. But dialogue, empathy, and understanding, these were the tools that could tear those walls down. And slowly, piece by piece, the foundation of trust was built. The officers, though hesitant at first, began to see Kai as more than a stereotype. Marcus, with his steady calm, had given them a chance to reconsider their assumptions. And for the first time that evening, as the tension slowly began to ease, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope, not just for Kai, but for himself, for the possibility that change, however small, was always within reach. The night that had started with tension, uncertainty, and fear now felt like it was shifting towards something deeper, more transformative. Marcus sat in the small living room with Amara, Kai, and the officers, the weight of the moment hanging in the air like a thick fog, only to slowly dissipate with every word spoken. What had initially felt like a breaking point, a moment where everything might unravel, had now become a space of collective reflection. The police officers, initially stiff and guarded, had begun to soften, their body language more open. Kai, though still quiet, seemed to relax a fraction as he looked at Marcus. Amara, standing by the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, was no longer the angry mother desperate to protect her son. Now she was a partner, someone who stood beside Marcus, quietly willing to trust the process. The breakthrough came slowly, not in one single dramatic revelation, but in a series of small moments, a shared glance between Marcus and Amara, a soft word from one of the officers that acknowledged their humanity, a hesitant smile from Kai as he met Marcus's eyes. It was as if the weight of assumptions and judgments that had been hanging over all of them was gradually lifting, not by confrontation, but through a quiet understanding that they had been misjudged, all of them. As the officers continued their questioning, The tone had shifted from suspicion to a more neutral curiosity. The taller officer, who had been the most resistant, was now asking more probing questions. But this time, they weren't laced with doubt. They were seeking clarity. "Kai," he said, his voice a little softer now, "what happened out there? We just want to know what went wrong so we can help you." Kai, his hands nervously gripping the edge of the couch, looked at Marcus and then at his mother. His eyes were heavy with everything he hadn't been able to say, everything he had been carrying in silence. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then finally spoke, his voice cracking. I was with some friends. We were just hanging out, having fun. But one of them got into it with a guy in the street, and it just escalated. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want to be like that. But I didn't know how to stop it. And before I knew it, the cops were there. There was a pause. The room was quiet. Marcus could see the internal struggle in Kai's face, the conflict of wanting to protect himself, wanting to avoid trouble, but also wanting to make things right. Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm, his eyes focused on Kai. "You did the right thing by not getting involved. You recognized that what was happening wasn't right. That's what matters." The officers exchanged another glance. This time it was less about suspicion and more about consideration. "You're lucky it didn't go worse," the officer said quietly, not to chastise but almost to acknowledge the choice Kai had made in that moment. He wasn't the only one who saw it. Amara, who had been standing quietly at the door, finally stepped forward. Her voice was steady, though filled with emotion. "Kai has had to grow up too fast," she said, looking at the officers, then turning to Marcus. "He's trying. He's been through a lot, and sometimes it's hard for him to know what to do when he feels threatened. But he's not a bad kid." Marcus felt his heart swell with empathy as he watched Amara, her vulnerability laid bare for everyone in the room. The strength it had taken for her to not only protect her children, but to step into this moment with her own pain and fear was something Marcus hadn't fully understood until now. He had always admired Amara's resilience, but in this moment he saw her as something more, someone who had given so much of herself to make sure her children felt safe, even when the world around them didn't seem to care. One of the officers, the younger of the two, nodded as though processing what had just been said. "We'll report this differently. It's clear this wasn't what we thought it was," he said quietly. "We'll make sure it's on record that you were not involved in anything criminal, Kai. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." Marcus, sensing that the conversation was beginning to wind down, glanced at Amara. His gaze met hers, and for a moment they shared a wordless communication, a bond that had only strengthened over the past few weeks. What had started as a relationship defined by uncertainty and fear was now, in this space, something more rooted, something that held hope. The officer who had been the most reserved throughout the night shifted his stance, and with a deep sigh, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Look, I'm sorry too," he said to Kai. "We didn't approach this with the understanding we should have had. There's no excuse for that. We should have seen the situation differently. People make mistakes, but it doesn't mean they're bad people." The younger officer nodded in agreement. "We've all been there," he added, glancing at his partner. "Not everyone grows up with the same privileges. Some of us don't get second chances. So when we see a kid from the wrong neighborhood, sometimes we don't take the time to ask the right questions. We just assume. I'm sorry for that." Marcus could see the shift in their eyes now. They weren't just seeing Kai as a problem or a statistic. They were seeing him as a young man, struggling to find his way, just like any other kid. In that moment, Marcus understood that the true power of reconciliation wasn't always in grand gestures. It was in moments like this, when people were willing to let down their guards, to admit their faults, and to genuinely seek understanding. Amara took a deep breath, stepping closer to Marcus. The officers, too, seemed to relax, their shoulders less tense as they exchanged a final glance. The room, which had once been filled with an almost suffocating tension, was now a space of calm. "We'll take care of this," the older officer said, turning toward the door. "And I think we all learned something tonight." Marcus watched as the officers left, stepping into the night with a newfound understanding. He turned to Amara and Kai, who were now sitting side by side on the couch, a sense of relief settling over them. It wasn't over, not by any means. But something fundamental had changed. They had come together, not just as individuals, but as a collective, as a family and a community, to address a misunderstanding, to heal, and to move forward. I think we're going to be okay, Marcus said, his voice soft but confident. He looked at Amara, then at Kai, who was now sitting up straighter, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. Amara nodded, her hand resting gently on Kai's shoulder. We've got each other, she said quietly, and that's all we need. In that moment, Marcus realized the depth of what he had found. He had entered this journey unsure of what he was seeking, but now, surrounded by Amara and her children, he understood. The bonds they had formed were stronger than any external force. The misunderstandings that had threatened to tear them apart were now the very things that brought them together. They had learned to listen, to empathize, and to grow. And it was in that shared growth that they would find the strength to move forward, no matter what came next. With a renewed sense of purpose, Marcus sat back, his heart full. The journey ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but for the first time, he felt ready. Ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of that night began to spread throughout the community, slowly but steadily transforming the landscape of their lives. The officers, no longer seeing Kai through the lens of prejudice and suspicion, began to show up at local events, not as enforcers of authority, but as active participants in the community. They attended neighborhood meetings, listened to the concerns of the residents, and took the time to speak with the young people they once viewed as threats. Their presence was a subtle reminder that change was possible, and though it didn't erase the past, it signaled a collective shift toward reconciliation. Kai, initially hesitant to engage with the world again after the ordeal, began to feel a sense of empowerment. With his mother by his side and Marcus offering steady guidance, he began attending community workshops aimed at helping young people develop skills for conflict resolution, emotional management, and self-advocacy. It wasn't an overnight transformation. He still carried the weight of his past experiences. But the more he engaged with others, the more he realized that he wasn't defined by the incidents of his past, nor the expectations of others. There was a world out there that wanted to see him succeed, and for the first time in a long time, he believed it. For Marcus, the change was equally profound. He had entered this journey unsure of what he would find in this new family, this new community, but he had discovered something deeper than he could have imagined. What began as a series of misunderstandings had become a lesson in empathy, patience, and above all, humility. As a doctor, he had spent years diagnosing and treating physical ailments, but it was the emotional wounds, the unseen scars of his family and community that had shaped him more than any medical case. His relationship with Amara and her children had given him a new perspective on what it meant to truly heal, to build bridges and foster understanding in spaces where there was once division. Amara, too, found herself becoming a more active voice in the community, her experiences and insights valued by those who had once dismissed her. She began organizing local support groups for parents who faced similar challenges with their children, particularly with the pressures of living in a community where safety and opportunity were often in short supply. These groups, born from her own desire to protect her children, grew into powerful networks of mothers, fathers, and caregivers who found strength in one another's stories. Amara's natural leadership, combined with her compassion, made her a figure of hope and empowerment for others. One of the most significant developments came when Marcus and Amara decided to collaborate on a project that would merge his medical expertise with her community leadership. They organized a health and wellness fair that offered free medical checkups, mental health counseling, and workshops on nutrition, parenting, and self-care. The event was held in a park at the heart of their neighborhood, where the sounds of children playing and music from local performers filled the air. It was an event that spoke to the hope and unity they had fought for, a day that brought people together not as strangers or adversaries, but as partners in a shared vision. The fair was a success beyond what Marcus and Amara had hoped for. Hundreds of families attended, many of whom had never considered seeking medical advice or attending community events before. Local businesses pitched in, donating food and supplies, and even the officers who had initially been a part of the tense encounter with Kai showed up to lend a hand, handing out water bottles, helping with logistics, and talking to the kids. It wasn't just a health fair. It was a symbol of the transformation that had taken root. It was a day where walls were broken down and people came together to support one another, no longer seeing each other as isolated individuals, but as parts of a larger, interconnected whole. As the event wound down, Marcus stood with Amara near the entrance, watching people leave with smiles on their faces and a renewed sense of community. For a moment, he allowed himself to reflect on how far they had come. He thought of Kai, who had been so uncertain just a few months ago, now confidently chatting with other kids from the neighborhood, no longer weighed down by the fear of being misunderstood. He thought of Amara, who had been carrying the burden of protecting her children alone, now standing beside him as an equal, a partner in every sense of the word. And he thought of the officers who, just weeks ago, had viewed him and everyone in this community through a lens of suspicion, but now saw them as equals, as people worthy of respect. In the quiet moments that followed the fair, Marcus and Amara stood together, their hands gently touching as they watched the last few people filter out of the park. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the neighborhood, and for the first time in a long while, everything felt right. They had faced adversity and doubt, and though they had not solved every problem or healed every wound, they had created something real and lasting, a foundation of trust, empathy, and hope. "I think this is just the beginning," Amara said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. Marcus smiled, the weight of the past few months settling into a sense of peace. "It is," he agreed, "but it's a good beginning." As they left the park hand in hand, Marcus realized that the journey ahead was still uncertain. There would be more struggles, more challenges, but there was a strength in what they had built, a strength in the unity they had cultivated. It was a reminder that real change didn't come from one person or one event, but from the collective power of individuals coming together, acknowledging their differences and working towards something greater. And as long as they continued to walk forward together, with empathy and a shared purpose, there was no limit to the positive change they could create. As the months passed, the once divided community began to show tangible signs of transformation, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a profound sense of fulfillment. The small moments of change added up to something powerful. He had spent so much of his life focused on healing the body, but now standing side by side with Amara, he saw the results of his efforts in a different light. It was in the faces of the people who showed up at the wellness fairs, the families who sat down to listen and share their stories, and the children who no longer viewed the police as enemies but as allies. The realization that he had played a part in shifting those perceptions, in helping bridge the gap between people who had once felt like strangers to one another, filled him with an unshakable sense of pride. The neighborhood was different now, not just because of the visible changes, like the wellness programs or the increased police presence at community events, but because of the spirit that had begun to take root. There was a collective energy, an understanding that had been nurtured over time, in the quiet conversations between neighbors, in the forgiveness that had taken place when old wounds were reopened, and in the genuine efforts to listen to one another. Marcus had always believed in the power of healing, but now he understood that healing wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul of a community, and the heart of that community was stronger than ever before. Amara, too, had found a sense of purpose that she had been searching for. Her initial desire to protect her children, especially Kai, had expanded into a deeper commitment to help others in the community. What began as a mother's fierce love for her child had grown into something more. She wasn't just an advocate for her own family anymore. She had become an advocate for the entire neighborhood, pushing for greater opportunities, better schools, and more support for families facing the same struggles. The way she navigated this role, balancing her devotion to her family with her newfound role as a leader, became an inspiration to others. She was living proof that strength could come from vulnerability, and that true leadership wasn't about being in control but about elevating others. There were moments of doubt, of course, when tensions flared over certain issues or when some old wounds resurfaced. Both Marcus and Amara would sometimes question whether the progress they had made was enough, or if the deep divides in society could truly ever be healed. But those doubts were fleeting, replaced by the undeniable evidence of the good that had come from their efforts. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But the work they had done had created a framework of understanding, and that was something that would continue to grow long after the wellness fairs ended and the officers went back to their usual duties. One evening, after another successful community gathering, Marcus sat down with the officers who had been part of the initial confrontation with Kai. This time, they were meeting not as strangers or figures of authority, but as equals. The air was light, the conversation flowing more easily than it had months ago. One of the officers, Jake, who had initially been one of the most resistant to change, spoke with a newfound openness. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "when we first got involved in all this, I wasn't sure what to expect. It felt like we were just stepping into a conflict we didn't fully understand. But now, I can see the difference it makes. When we show up, when we engage, when we just listen, it changes the whole dynamic." Marcus nodded in agreement. "It's about trust, right? You've built a bridge with this community, and that's something that can't be undone. It's not just about what we do as individuals, but what we do together." Another officer, Sarah, added, "And it's also about accountability. We're not perfect. We make mistakes. But being willing to admit that and move forward together, that's where the real progress is." The conversation shifted to the future. As they discussed their hopes for continued collaboration, it became clear that the relationship between the police and the community wasn't just about getting through difficult moments, but about setting a precedent for what was possible when people worked together. They talked about future initiatives, more community patrols where police officers walk the streets not in cars, but on foot, engaging in casual conversations with residents, learning their names and stories. They discussed creating mentorship programs where young people, particularly those who had felt the sting of systemic injustice, could learn from officers who were committed to being a positive presence. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about using it as a foundation to build something stronger, something that could withstand the challenges ahead. The most heartening part of these discussions was that the officers didn't just view their role as enforcers of the law, but as contributors to a broader community effort. They understood that it wasn't enough to simply act as guardians of the peace. They had to be a part of the healing process too. Marcus and Amara, for their part, felt a sense of hope in these conversations that they hadn't felt in years. They saw that true change was not an isolated effort, but something that required everyone's involvement, from the families in the neighborhood to the police officers on the beat. As the seasons changed, Marcus found himself reflecting on how far they had come. The community that had once felt fractured and divided now felt like a living, breathing organism, each part working together to create something more beautiful than any one person could have imagined. There were still obstacles to overcome, still battles to fight, but the foundation of understanding had been laid, and that foundation was sturdy enough to hold whatever might come. The moment of ultimate fulfillment for Marcus came one evening as he and Amara walked through the park, hand in hand. The same park where they had once held the wellness fair, now filled with laughter and voices of children playing, families talking, and even the occasional officer sitting on a bench, chatting with a neighbor. It was a simple moment, but it spoke volumes. "This is what we wanted, isn't it?" Amara said, her voice soft but sure. Marcus smiled. "Yes, this is just the beginning, and I'm proud of what we've created." They stood there for a long moment, watching the sunset, knowing that the work they had begun was far from over. But in the quiet of the park, surrounded by their community, they understood that together they could accomplish anything. It wasn't just about the changes they had made. It was about the change they had sparked in each other and in the hearts of everyone around them. And that, to Marcus, was the most fulfilling part of all. As the years passed, the neighborhood continued to thrive in ways that no one could have predicted. The community, once divided by deep-seated mistrust and misunderstandings, had found strength in unity, and the changes they had worked so hard to build were not fleeting, they were lasting. The wellness fairs became annual events, now celebrated not just as health initiatives, but as symbols of resilience and collective growth. The collaboration between the officers and the community grew even stronger, with both groups recognizing that their success was rooted in the ability to listen, to understand, and to forgive. Marcus and Amara often walked through the neighborhood together, witnessing firsthand the subtle shifts in attitudes, the way people now greeted one another with genuine warmth instead of suspicion. What had begun as an act of courage, standing up in the face of adversity, fighting for a better future for their children and community, had transformed into a movement of hope that was shared by all. Kai, once burdened by the weight of prejudice, had blossomed into a young man who inspired others with his determination to create a different future for himself and his peers. He now spoke at local schools, telling his story to younger children, encouraging them to find their voice and believe in their worth. There was a newfound energy in the neighborhood, a sense of purpose that fueled every corner of their shared lives. Whether it was a local business owner donating supplies for a community garden or a police officer offering mentorship to a young person, each action, no matter how small, contributed to a collective vision of a more compassionate and understanding world. The lessons they had learned from each other, the importance of dialogue, the need for vulnerability, the power of empathy, had become woven into the fabric of the community. One evening, as Marcus and Amara sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they reflected on the journey they had taken. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of frustration, and of fear, but each step had brought them closer to a truth they had only begun to understand at the start of their journey. That true change came from within, from the willingness to confront the uncomfortable and to work toward a vision that was bigger than any one person's individual experience. "Do you think we've made a difference?" Marcus asked, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of years of hard work. Amara turned to him, her smile gentle but filled with conviction. "I think we've done more than make a difference," she said. "We've sparked a movement, and that movement is going to keep growing long after we're gone, because we've shown people what's possible when we come together with open hearts and minds." It was a simple statement, but it encapsulated everything they had fought for. It was no longer just about one family or one neighborhood. It was about the ripple effects of kindness, of compassion, of building connections where there were once divisions. The world, Marcus and Amara realized, was not a perfect place. There would always be challenges to overcome, misunderstandings to navigate, and prejudices to confront. But there was power in the unity they had built, in the strength that came from lifting each other up instead of tearing each other down. And so they made a pact that evening, one that would guide their actions for years to come. They would continue to be the change they wanted to see, not just in their own community, but in every place they could reach. They would foster understanding, break down barriers, and lead with compassion, knowing that each act of kindness, each conversation, and each effort to build trust was an investment in the future of the world. As the night settled in, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted from the street, a reminder of how far they had come. The children in the neighborhood, the officers who had once been strangers, and the residents who had once lived in fear of one another were now united in their shared belief in a better future. The work was far from over, but the foundation had been laid, and that in itself was a triumph. Marcus and Amara stood up, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. They knew that change was not something that could be rushed. It was a journey, a lifelong commitment. But as long as they continued to walk together, side by side, they would continue to build a world where compassion, understanding, and unity could flourish. The story of their community was just one example, but it was a story they were determined to tell over and over again, to show the world that when we come together, there is no limit to the positive change we can create. And with that, they stepped into the future, with hope in their hearts and the conviction that their work was far from finished, but their resolve had never been stronger.